Hi, I'm Brandice Canes-Wrone, faculty member in the Department of Politics at Princeton and the School of Public and International Affairs. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, and I'm just delighted today to have an eminent group of Princeton faculty to discuss the first 100 days of Biden's presidency and the Biden-Harris administration. With us today, we have Professor Chuck Cameron, who's also in the Department of Politics and School of Public and International Affairs, Martha Coven, who is the John L. Weinberg Goldman Sachs and Company visiting professor in SPIA, the School of Public and International Affairs. Martha has been a part of the Biden-Harris transition team, and I know she'll say a bit about that today. We have Leflore Stevens-Dougan, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics, and Lauren Wright, who's an associate research scholar and lecturer in politics and public affairs. Without further ado, we're going to get into their comments. So the structure of today's panel is that each panelist is going to speak for 10 to 12 minutes, giving some insights into their particular areas of expertise. Then we'll open up to the Q&A. As the announcement stated, please type your questions in at the bottom of your Zoom screen, where it suggests that there's a Q&A function. You can send them in at any point during the session, but we'll be taking them as a group after each panelist has had a chance to speak. So thanks for joining us, and we'll begin with Chuck Cameron. So to say just a bit more in detail about each speaker, Professor Cameron is an expert in political institutions, including the US presidency, legislatures, as well as courts and law. He has an award-winning book, Veto Bargaining, Presidents and the Politics of Negative Power, which won multiple awards from the American Political Science Association and is assigned in undergraduate classes nationwide. Perhaps I should say worldwide, though it is on the US presidency, so perhaps more in the United States. He's won multiple grants from the National Science Foundation and has been a fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Hoover Institution. He was a fellow here at Princeton before we convinced him to come here after 15 years at Columbia University. And he's a sought after visiting professor at New York Law School when they can secure his some of his time. Chuck also holds his MPA, his Master's in Public Affairs, and PhD from the School of Public Affairs here at Princeton. So it was a bit of homecoming when he finally returned. So thanks, Chuck, for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Brandice, for having me. I think this is going to be fun and interesting. Let me get my slides up. And while I do that, I want to just put out two quick caveats. I'm going to actually show you my grades for the Biden administration. And for those of you whose brains are on partisanship, you may be rooting or booing as I put those up. But the basis for doing that is the scholarly literature and comparisons with other presidents. I'm just trying to grade them on the, pitching and fielding and hitting. And if you think I'm being too partisan, call me out. In addition, I'm not going to talk about some of the grand strategy issues, which are really interesting, and I think we should get into them. But instead, I'm going to talk about four themes, and here they are. First is return to normalcy. Second is back to basics. Third is Lucky Joe, and 550 days. So return to normalcy. I think this is something that probably everybody is going to want to say a few words about. But what I mean is presidency by tweet is stopping. Inflaming the base into rabid anger is over. And management by chaos has been replaced by a high degree of discipline and professionalism. And in this sense, the Biden start is pretty boring, right? It's pretty boring, right? But boring is good, right? Boring is good. Now, the second theme that I want to talk about is Lucky Joe. And here we can see that the opening of the Biden administration has been shaped by three incredibly fortuitous events for them. The first is, of course, miracle vaccines. If those vaccines weren't there, the challenge facing the Biden administration would be truly horrible and would look something much more like what you see in Europe. But the presence of those vaccines means that there's a logistical challenge of rolling them out, but that is far, far simpler than conjuring up this. So thank you, science. Again, if you're a partisan Democrat, it's going to be ashes in your mouth to say the Trump administration did something right, but here they did something big and did it right. The second incredibly fortunate thing is 2 seats in Georgia. Right, by all reasonable standards, the Republicans should hold those seats and not the Democrats. And I cannot emphasize strongly enough that a 50-50 Senate is a completely different proposition from a 49-51 Senate or a 48-52 Senate. The difference is night and day. The 50-50 Senate is going to make progressives weep salty tears into their pillow every night, but it's still possible to do some things. If those 2 seats had gone the other way, or even one of them had gone the other way, the legislative part of the Biden presidency would now be over, right? So incredibly lucky. And the third thing that was so lucky is that the media moguls deplatformed Trump, right? And so instead of an endless barrage of invective, right, witty invective and incredibly effective use of Twitter, the president's been silenced, and that makes things so much easier for the Biden administration, right? We can talk more about that. All right, the third thing I want to discuss is back to presidential basics, back to basics, right? Like your gym in January, all right? And the standard playbook is coming out, right? So the Trump administration took the standard playbook and more or less threw it out. What do I mean by the standard playbook? I mean that presidential scholars and people who've served in the White House and have studied it and passed on their wisdom have a pretty definite idea about how it works. In some sense, being president is a little bit like being a plumber. There's stuff you need to know, right? And the playbook has come out. And that allows us to do the scorecard. So here's my scorecard. Okay, here's a few things. First, fire the campaigners, hire the managers. This is a really painful moment for presidents in every presidency, right? Running for the presidency is humiliating and a terrible job, and the president has great affection for the people who helped him do it. But the skill sets that they have are the wrong skill sets once you win. And so they need a warm handshake and be escorted off the premises as fast as possible, and the right people brought back. And the Biden administration has done that in superb fashion, and I give them an A+ on that. The second is stand up a government fast. All right, when you walk into the White House, you'd think there would be an executive secretariat. It's just an empty building, and across the government, the top jobs are all vacant. So lights on, nobody's home. You need to stand up a government fast. A+ they get for that. Fantastic job. Then you have to handle crises, the initial crises, the crises you expected and the crises you didn't. Right, and excuse me, I give them an A- on Corona, and on immigration, the situation at the border, an F. Again, we can discuss this, and I can explain to you why what my ratings are there. Setting the agenda in Congress, A, fantastic job. Managing the unruly Democratic tribes. The Democratic Party is a coalition, a fractious coalition of very different groups who want very different things. Managing that coalition is very difficult. Maybe this is an A+ instead of an A. Up to this point, the Biden administration has done a masterful job of that. Seizing control of the bureaucracy, not so great. It's only 100 days. I give them a B. Using unilateral executive action like executive orders, again, a B. Building a friendly judiciary, B-. And then the last, of course, is preparing for the worst. Preparing for the worst. And here's the fourth theme here. We're talking 100 days, but the 100 days are a prelude to the next 550 days. And in particular, every moment of the 100 days and every moment of the subsequent days needs to be focused on this Tuesday, November 8th, 2022, when the day the Democrats will lose Congress. Everything needs to be directed at that, because on November 9th, Biden's legislative program stops, it ends, it's over. Instead, everything shifts to the administrative game. It doesn't, right? The presidency doesn't stop, but the nature of the presidency changes dramatically. And they need to get ready for that now, right? This was not a strong suit for the Obama administration. And here's like a little get ready checklist. Number one, Justice Breyer needs to be persuaded to retire, get off the court, and be replaced as soon as possible. Second, every vacancy on the DC Circuit must be filled. That's because the lifeblood of the administrative state is regulations and rules. They need to be written right now, and it takes a while. Many of them are heading for the DC Circuit. If the Democrats don't have solid control, they're going to die there. And then the third is there's 800 positions across the bureaucracy. We've reinstated essentially a spoil system, and we need to they need to fill those positions. They must be ready to go. And then finally, OMB and OIRA have to be ready to roll, and I'm sure Martha's going to talk more about that. I'm going to stop here, Brandice, and I hope that's sufficiently provocative to give some people some questions or comments, and then let's turn it over to the next speaker, okay?
Thanks, Chuck, for those great insights. I know they prompted, I have questions for you if the audience doesn't ask them about where some of these grades came from. But I mean, not that I disagree, but just, you know, I'd love to hear in more depth. So thanks for those provocative comments. So next in alphabetical order, we have Martha Coven, who, as mentioned earlier, is the John L. Weinberg and Goldman Sachs visiting professor at SPIA. Martha spent her career inside and outside government working on domestic policy with a particular focus on poverty reduction and the federal budget. She served for 6 years in the Obama administration, first as Associate Director for Education, Income Maintenance, and Labor in the Office of Management and Budget, so an OMB. And then for the next 3 years, she was a special assistant to the president at the Domestic Policy Council, focusing in areas including anti-poverty, initiatives, childhood obesity, and training and employment services. Prior to coming to joining the Obama administration, Martha spent 8 years in the nonprofit center, and before that, she began her career on Capitol Hill working for the House Democratic leadership. I mentioned in the introductory remarks, Martha also has been a part of the Biden-Harris transition team, so I'm really excited for any inside scoop that we haven't been able to get from the media, as well as what are always for quite insightful comments on politics in DC.
Great. Thank you, Brandice, and thanks everyone for joining us. So the first 100 days of a presidency are always an exciting time, at least for those of us who are interested in politics and policy. Even if it's not the candidate you voted for, there's just a lot of change happening and to observe. There's a fresh voice in the White House and a quite different voice, as Chuck pointed out. There are new personnel across the executive branch. I'll come back to that. And of course, there's a new agenda. I would say this presidency has been particularly exciting across all of these dimensions. One of the things I've been asked to talk about is the pre-inaugural transition period, and I'll turn to that in a moment. But before I get to the transition, I wanted to start by reflecting that a presidency ultimately is judged not by what it starts, but by what it finishes. And further, by whether those accomplishments are lasting accomplishments. I mean lasting primarily in the sense of policy legacy, although sometimes change can be lasting in terms of a shift in public attitudes, for example. And I'll come back to this issue of legacy at the end of my remarks. I do think that this presidency is, by most measures, off to a strong start. I'm not going to give grades the way that Chuck did, but I will say overall off to a strong start. And that start did begin in the transition, which was well planned and well executed. Some of that good planning was frankly driven by circumstances. I mean, President Biden clearly ran as the steady hand to take over government from someone who was clearly struggling to manage a horrendous pandemic, among many other challenges in our country. And so there was no choice but to bring his A game and insist that his team do the same. So the transition was very carefully planned, well-staffed, knowing that the handoff from a President Trump to a President Biden was not going to be an easy one. I should point out that as a historical matter, transitions, even when they're from one party to another, are not always hostile takeovers. In fact, President George W. Bush's transition to President Obama was widely praised and has served as a model. And even the Obama to Trump transition was relatively smooth. But the Biden transition was dealing with an outgoing administration that, for example, was often disparaging of the civil servants who staff government. I think the mindset that led them to label civil servants the deep state never entirely went away. And the outgoing political appointees during that transition period were sometimes flat out uncooperative. That was the case more at some agencies than at others. But it was a challenge right until the end at the Defense Department, for example, and also at the agency I was charged with overseeing, which is the Office of Management and Budget, which sits within the White House and helps manage regulatory, budget policy management issues across government. So, but it wasn't just those circumstances, the Trump to Biden circumstances, that led the Biden team to be so deliberate in their planning. I think the reason they had that solid transition and a pretty well executed first 100 days was because there was a clear direction from the president and his senior team to deliver quickly on the change that they had promised, not just in the context of the pandemic, although that obviously was job number one, but also in the context of the three other crises that he laid out as a candidate: the economy, climate change, and the calls for racial justice. And in each area, there was a very strong focus, starting in the transition, on turning the campaign promises into detailed policy. Sometimes it's called turning the poetry into the prose. And it was important to the president, because of who he is and the way that he communicates, that this was done in a way that was understandable to the public, that the policy was connected to people's everyday lives. So there was a lot of delivering quickly on this sort of policy change campaign promises. In fact, I remember being surprised and frankly a little concerned at the time while I was serving on the transition team at the sheer volume of draft executive orders and legislative proposals that were being produced. And that concern came for two reasons. The first, to be frank, is that I was just worried they were using up all their good stuff. And I say that because, as Brandice mentioned, I served for several years in the Obama White House. And I know that the media-driven demand for news can be insatiable. So my worry was, if you put all your good policy and all your good stuff out in the first week, the first month, the first 100 days, what happens when it's later in the year and there's nothing left to announce? Now, as it turns out, I was probably wrong to worry about the news cycle. For one thing, the nonstop high volume of legislative activity is producing plenty of fodder and plenty of things that are interesting to the public, interesting to the media, and so on. Secondly, I do think this White House is using other tools very effectively to stay in communication with the public, particularly travel. The president and vice president and their spouses have been hitting the road regularly, and they've also been using their cabinet very effectively to get around the country, even during a pandemic. So I think that first concern about the high volume probably was misplaced. I think that the dialogue with the public and the news will continue. The second reason, though, that I was concerned about the high volume of material being produced so early is that it sets up high expectations that they will now need to deliver on. There's some sweeping language in some of these early executive orders setting out big aspirational goals, goals that I share, goals that a majority of the public shares. But an executive order in and of itself doesn't actually accomplish anything. The hard work, in almost all circumstances, I should say, in a few cases it does. So the hard work of implementation is now what's just beginning, and at a very busy time, again, with a legislative agenda as well as an executive action agenda. So they've set up big expectations for themselves that they will now then have to deliver on. Another way I would say that they got themselves off to a quick start was in this staffing area. Chuck alluded to this. They moved very quickly to identify people who could be put in non-Senate confirmed positions. So these are appointees who could start on day one. You don't need to wait for the Senate confirmation process. In fact, I knew many people who were hired in not knowing who they'd ultimately be reporting to, because those people's names hadn't even been announced yet. Those nominations hadn't been put forward. They were just putting people in place so that they could be ready to hit the ground on day one. They also worked very diligently to identify a set of appointees who reflected the full rich diversity of this country across a whole array of dimensions. They've just released some kind of data points on that in the last 24 hours or so. And they did make a big and ultimately successful push to get their cabinet in place and a number of sub-cabinet nominees. So staffing was another area where they acted quickly and I think largely successfully. I should say all of this was done in a very challenging remote work environment. The transition was essentially 100% remote, which is extraordinary. But even now, many White House staff and agency appointees are working from their homes. In some cases, they're spread across the country. Just like every other American, they're juggling children responsibilities. They're juggling sometimes dealing with health issues, all of that on top of this high volume of activity out of a White House. So that is a challenge that they're all dealing with. Now, most of what I've said has been quite complimentary, and I mean it. I don't mean to suggest that this was an error-free transition or an error-free first 100 days. In the area of immigration, for example, I'm less inclined to judge their management of the southwest border in the terms that Chuck did. We can maybe talk about that later, but I will say that they clearly misstepped in how they handled this issue of setting the annual target for refugee admissions. That has been playing out in the media now for weeks, creating uncertainty for refugees planning to come to the United States and sending confusing messages about what the administration's values are there. That to me was a misstep. The other thing I'd point to is that occasionally, both in transition and in their early days in office, members of the administration would use the media to anonymously point fingers at someone internally who they felt wasn't doing an adequate job. To me, that's not a great look for any organization, whether it's a political organization or something else. Though to be fair, they don't do it that often, and they certainly don't do it nearly as often as their immediate predecessors did. So again, overall, I would say I think this is a pretty strong start to administration. Let me close, though, by circling back to the point I made at the start about how presidencies are ultimately judged not by how they start, but by how they finish. And as Chuck said, unfortunately, that finish or that judgment point is coming soon. It's not in 4 years, it's in 18 months when the voters will be looking for results going into those midterm elections. I'm not as sure as Chuck is about the outcome of those elections, but there's no question it's going to be a challenging time for the president and his party. And to date, the victories that the administration has notched, and their significant victories, are temporary. So if you look across the 4 crises the president said on the campaign trail that he would address, turning to each of those one by one, on the pandemic, which as I said is job 1, yes, they're on track to succeed in defeating it, but that will hopefully be old news by the time November rolls around of next year. On racial equity, they are saying the right things, and I do not mean to dismiss the power of the bully pulpit in this circumstance. But ultimately, as President Obama used to say, it's not enough to admire a problem. We need to do something about it, and we need lasting change in the domain of racial justice and racial equity. On the economy, things are coming back when you look at the aggregate picture, but it's unclear whether, for example, the essential workers, low-paid workers in particular, will be any better off 18 months from now than they were before the pandemic. Now, there is an extraordinary temporary response in place right now, including some really exciting advances that are preventing poverty among families with children in particular, but that policy right now is all temporary. There's the need for further action by Congress, which the president called for last night, where there are razor-thin margins to pull this off. So there's a need for further action by Congress to make those lasting gains. Right now, all we have largely is temporary gains. The same is largely true on climate policy. Executive action only gets you so far and often is easily reversed. And even in the domain of foreign policy, again, that's another place where it's hard to make lasting changes, although interestingly, I think the decision to pull troops out of Afghanistan, my prediction will just have to stick because it sets the bar so high for a future president to do anything else policy-wise. So what I'm looking for in the next 100 days and the next several hundred after that is places where the Biden administration, in partnership with Congress, truly sticks the landing and manages to deliver lasting change for essential and other low-paid workers, for people seeking racial justice, and for the health of the planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martha, for those really insightful comments. Again, questions in my own mind, so but we'll let the audience take the lead there. Next, we have Leflore Stevens-Dougan. Leflore is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics, and her research areas include public opinion, voting behavior, racial attitudes, and Black politics. She has a recent book, Race to the Bottom: How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics, which was recently published by the University of Chicago Press. She has grants from the Russell Sage Foundation, a number of other organizations, including the National Science Foundation, and her work is being published in major political science journals. We're really excited to have her on the faculty, and of course, very excited to have her here today to share her insights on the Biden-Harris administration's first 100 days.
Thanks for that warm introduction, Brandice. I am really excited to be here today to talk about the Biden administration's first 100 days. So first today, I'd like to begin my comments with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And no, this is probably not one of those content of your character quotes that the audience is largely familiar with. This is a quote that I think gets trotted out far less often, but I think is really relevant for today's discussion. So King is quoted as saying, "Loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear. But for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook." So in other words, King was making the argument that there is a principal policy gap, right? This is the idea that in principle, many Americans aspire to and believe in the idea of racial equality, racial justice, but when it actually comes to implementing policy, there tends to be a gap between those ideals and the actual implementation. And I think this is relevant to our assessment of Biden's first 100 days when it comes to matters of race, right? So in the case of President Biden, and for a lot of politicians, it's very easy to make sort of lofty statements about equality, but for those statements to be credible, there has to be substantive follow through. And for President Biden, racial equality, as Martha noted earlier, was a central part of his platform. He campaigned on restoring the soul of the nation, and he was elected after naming systemic racism as one of the 4 major crises facing the nation. It's also worth noting that in terms of electoral matters, that Black and Latino voters were key to his victory in several battleground states, so including places like Michigan, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. And as Chuck noted also, when we think about a place like Georgia and now having 50-50 control of the Senate, or I guess not control, but a 50-50 Senate, Black voters in Georgia, for example, were key to securing that. So in light of this sort of racial backdrop, what has Biden's follow through on racial equality looked like during his first 100 days in office? Well, one, he started his presidency by naming the most racially diverse cabinet in history. It's worth noting, however, that he did draw some criticism from the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus for not appointing any Asian American or Pacific Islander secretaries, right? But at least in terms of sort of the symbolism of having a diverse cabinet, he's delivered on that. It's also the most women in a cabinet in history as well. And so by referring to that as symbolic, I'm not saying that it was only symbolic, because who has a voice at the table definitely has implications for substantive policy. But this is a marked contrast to the previous administration, for example, which had one of the least diverse cabinets since Reagan, I believe. Biden also began by issuing a series of executive orders that addressed race and racial inequality. So one, he disbanded former President Trump's 1776 commission. And this was essentially a commission that was a backlash to the 1619 project that basically talked about systemic racism in the United States head on. So this again is a marked turn from what we saw with the previous administration. Biden has also directed the Justice Department not to renew federal contracts with private prisons. He's issued a memorandum to HUD, saying that he will redress historical racism in federal housing policies. And again, that's an area of, in some ways, that's a little light on substance. You know, it's a little vague to just say that he's going to redress historical racism in federal housing policies. We know about things like redlining, we know about federal highway policy, but in terms of the actual substance, it's maybe a little thin in terms of what he's actually planning to do there. We also know that his recovery plan in many ways targets underserved communities, and he's called this out pretty explicitly, right? So whether he's talking about his recovery plan or even climate change policy, things of that nature, he's actually, at least in his rhetoric, really been centering racial equality and racial justice, right? So he's done things like called out for paid leave for women forced out of jobs, unemployment benefits that largely help Black and brown workers. He's also expanded tax, or at least called for the expansion of tax credits for low-income Americans who are disproportionately non-white. And in the wake of both the murder of George Floyd and last summer's racial justice protests, he really has what we as political scientists would refer to as a policy window, right? This is a unique opportunity that's likely closing shortly, but in which he can really push for racial equality, and I think more so than any president that we've seen in recent history. My own research in terms of how politicians talk about race and racial justice suggests that Biden in some ways is uniquely positioned to talk about race and actually espouse racially liberal policies in a way that other Democrats, most notably the President Obama, were not able to, right? My research suggests that white politicians really have this latitude that's very different from their Black counterparts. If you can think back to the time under our nation's first Black president, you can likely remember that he actually went to great lengths to be seen as the president for all Americans, as opposed to being a president for Black Americans. That's not to say that Biden's casting himself as just a president for Black Americans, but he's been able to say things a lot more explicitly than an Obama likely would have been able to say, or even his vice president, Kamala Harris, right? So he said things, in his acceptance speech, like, Black America, I have your back. He talks explicitly about systemic racism. And the research indicates that Biden, in a lot of ways, is less constrained on these matters because Black Democrats are actually the most likely to be perceived as favoring Blacks over whites. And there's a real concern among some voters that they're going to be beholden to their Black constituents. Also, in line with some of his comments around racial justice, in the wake of the Chauvin conviction, President Biden was even quoted as saying, or in his speech in response, he said that we have all seen the knee of injustice on the neck of Black Americans. And think about this, if we contrast this, not to just keep on bringing up Obama, but if we think about the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of Trayvon Martin, these comments are very different than what Obama said, right? So Obama said something to the effect of, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. But, it was pretty light in terms of any sort of invocation of systemic racism or concerns about racial justice. That's not to say that they weren't there, but the point here is the latitude in which Biden has to be able to make some of these claims around systemic racism and racial inequality, I think are a lot greater than many other Democrats, particularly Black Democrats. And that's also, I think, even relevant to the response that we saw last night from the GOP in the rebuttal and the choice of, say, Tim Scott to espouse a more sort of racially conservative message, which in some ways he, as a Black politician, has more latitude to do. So this notion that, he stated something to the effect of America is not a racist country, I think speaks to, again, the sort of different tensions and constraints and latitude that different types of politicians have to speak about race, depending on both their own racial identity and their own partisan identity. And, you know, in light of all of this, I'm not saying that Biden doesn't face any constraint on racial matters. You know, things like defunding the police, he's been very clear and explicit that he does not support that. So there are limits, I think, to which he can actually push for racial justice without potentially isolating more racially moderate to conservative voters. It's also worth noting that when he ran, when he was campaigning last summer, that he vowed to issue an executive order creating a policing commission to study paths for police reform. He's actually not done this, but has instead pushed for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So it looks like he's maybe stepping away from commissions, which in some way might be good. The Obama administration had a commission on policing, so did the Trump administration. But in terms of actual policy that came out of it, you know, there's some members of the more progressive wing of the party that might say that the substance there was lacking. So instead, he's really pushing for sort of the legislative avenues for the bill to pass in Congress. And just as sort of a refresher, that act is going to, or it calls for banning racial profiling at every level of law enforcement, banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants, at least at the federal level, eliminating qualified immunity for officers, and also a national police misconduct registry, so that officers who maybe behave poorly in one police department couldn't be hired by another police department. And so it still kind of remains to be seen how much of this will actually be able to get through the Congress if this bill is going to pass. But my argument here is that there's a pretty narrow policy window that he's trying to, I think, take advantage of at this time by pushing this as part of his agenda. And in terms of where the public sees this, it's a bit mixed, right? Last summer, when we were at the height of these racial justice protests, there was large support for, the Black Lives Matter movement. Last June, roughly 60% of Americans described George Floyd's death as murder. Now, even after Chauvin's conviction on account of murder, this percentage has now dropped to only 36%, right? So even where the public's at has maybe shifted, and that might likely influence his ability to really push for racial justice. And there's also tensions that are going to, I think, emerge within the Democratic Party around this, right? So you have a very progressive wing, but not all Democrats are as progressive as some of maybe those who are in support of BLM and even more progressive measures than what the Floyd Policing Act is calling for. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds over the next 100 days and couple of 100 days in terms of sort of the tension he's going to face even within his own party in terms of pushing for a progressive racial agenda. But at least in the first 100 days, there has been, I would argue, some substantive gains that he has made, and definitely a shift from the previous administration. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, LaFleur, for those really interesting comments and your expertise. So last on the panel today, in terms of prepared remarks, we have Lauren Wright. As mentioned earlier, Lauren is Associate Research Scholar and Lecturer in Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton. She teaches courses on the presidency and executive power, political communication, women in politics, among other areas. She's the author of two recent books, or somewhat recent, one last year, Star Power, American Democracy in the Age of Celebrity Candidates. And then 4 years before that, in 2016, on behalf of the president, presidential spouses and White House communication strategy. Some of you may recognize Lauren if you think she looks familiar. That may be not just from campus, but because of her frequent appearances on many major networks, including CNN, BBC, CBS, C-SPAN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Her research and commentary is also published in a lot of leading outlets, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and US News Report, as well as more political outlets such as The Hill. Lauren's also a board member of the White House Transition Project, and I just want to clarify, whereas Martha is on the Biden-Harris transition team, Lauren is part of an organization that has existed since 1997 of presidency scholars it's a nonpartisan association which gives advice to presidents of any party who are coming into office to help with all of those, major transition issues, such as the appointments. As Chuck mentioned, the lights are off, there's an empty building, and helping presidents, again, less on the specific appointments, but what are the steps that can make for a smooth transition into a new presidency. So Lauren, thanks for, again, sharing your wisdom today.
Thanks, Brandice. Let me go ahead and share my slides here. Thank you, everyone. So as Brandice mentioned, I have appointments in SPIA and the politics department here at Princeton, and I teach a variety of classes. But today, of course, we're talking about the first 100 days. And as we've seen so far, there are a variety of ways to assess a president's first 100 days in office. And so in my remarks, I'm going to focus on two areas of evaluation that I study. One is presidential efforts to increase public opinion of themselves and their policies through messaging. And another is how representative American government is. And specifically, I'll focus on the representation of women in the executive branch. So presidents have a number of tools that they use to attempt to influence public opinion of themselves, but perhaps the one that we hear about the most is direct appeals to the public, which we saw last night in President Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress. Scholars generally agree that these kinds of appeals don't move public opinion very much. And one reason is that in our fractured media environment, presidents really struggle to attract and hold the attention of the country. And while we don't have complete viewership data from last night's speech yet, what we do know is how many people watched Biden's first primetime address back in March, about 31 million people across 15 news networks, which may seem like an awful lot, especially if you consider the average audience size for nighttime cable news shows is about 1 to 3 million people. But Biden's audience size might actually have been somewhat of an upper bound since it was his very first televised primetime speech. And it also really depends which events you're comparing this to. So 49 million Americans watched Oprah's interview with Meghan and Harry on one network a few weeks ago. And about 97 million people in the US watched the Super Bowl in 2021, which was actually the event's smallest audience size in 14 years. So considering these challenges, how can presidents get their message out in such a competitive media environment? Well, one strategy they frequently use is deploying surrogates to amplify important policy messages, including presidential spouses, vice presidents, and vice presidential spouses. And sending surrogates out on their behalf allows presidents to be in more than one place at a time. And that's exactly what the White House had in mind when they sent Vice President Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff, and the First Lady out on a nationwide Help Is Here tour to promote the coronavirus relief package in mid-March. And so this is a picture of Vice President Harris and her husband at a restaurant in Denver promoting small business relief measures in the package, while the president was in Pennsylvania doing the same thing. Surrogates also tend to get different media coverage than presidents. And when it comes to the president's spouse in particular, coverage tends to be softer and more positive. And so here's a picture, for instance, of Jill Biden delivering cookies to National Guard troops on Capitol Hill at the end of January. Here we have a plot of the number of speeches made by first ladies and vice presidents over time. And you can see that in recent years leading up to the Trump administration, first ladies made more speeches than vice presidents. But this trend has actually flipped in recent years. Here we have a plot of the number of speeches given by spouses and vice presidents in the first 100 days of recent administrations, according to data from the White House briefing room websites. And it shows that beginning with the Trump administration, vice presidents seem to have outpaced spouses in their public messaging efforts. And so it's clear here that in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, Vice President Harris has been a very active public voice for the administration. So how can we tell if deploying surrogates like Vice President Harris, the First Lady, and the Second Gentleman are actually an effective way to boost opinion of President Biden? To understand this, I've been conducting messaging experiments for years that measure the opinion changes that result from attributing political speeches to various surrogates versus the president himself. And so today I want to share with you some preliminary results from a survey experiment I conducted in February to gauge the effectiveness of different Biden administration surrogates as public messengers compared to Biden himself. So respondents in this experiment were randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions in which they were shown a speech excerpt touting Biden's leadership and ability to unify the nation. Here's the first condition in which Biden's touting his own leadership abilities. And the quote here reads, "This is a time to heal in America. I will be a president who seeks not to divide but unify. I won't see red states and blue states. I will always see the United States." And in other conditions, respondents were shown the exact same speech excerpt, but now surrogates are talking about Biden rather than Biden talking about himself. And so in these conditions, the speech was attributed either to Vice President Harris, as you see here, Jill Biden, or Doug Emhoff. And here's one set of results. These are coefficients from regression models estimating the effect of each treatment condition on opinion of Joe Biden. And I'll first note that, consistent with my past research, all of these coefficients are positive. So it seems that in general, the public responds favorably to surrogates touting the president's strengths and accomplishments rather than the president himself, albeit these are of a fairly modest magnitude. And in some cases, as you can see, the effects are statistically significant. For example, the effect of the Harris treatment on approval of the president. So it seems at this point that Vice President Harris is an active and effective communicator on the president's behalf. And the vice president is part of a historically gender diverse cabinet with a record 11 women serving concurrently. And that's another metric certainly presidential administrations pay a lot of attention to. Public demands for descriptive representation in government are in sync with goals presidents set for themselves to assemble a cabinet that looks like America, as Bill Clinton once said. This graph shows the share of women serving in cabinet positions since FDR. And so we can see that there's been a substantial increase in the number of women over decades. And in recent administrations, we see this clear partisan trend where the share of women sharply increases when a Democrat takes office. And of course, the Biden administration is no exception. I'm also working on a larger project with Madeline Marr and Jonathan Mamolo that looks at gender representation at all levels of executive branch agencies going back to 1973. And here are some results from that work. Just to orient you here, the solid line shows the share of women serving in top tier Senate confirmed positions over time. And the dotted line shows the share of women serving in rank and file positions in the executive branch. And the red lines that you see are means within each party's tenure in the White House. So we've observed the same partisan trend of increases in women serving in top tier appointments during Democratic administrations. And certainly it will be very interesting to see how these metrics progress in the Biden administration as more data become available. So to summarize here, on two important metrics, including White House communication strategy, especially regarding the deployment of surrogates, and gender representation at the cabinet level, the Biden administration has had a successful first 100 days. But of course, whether there's continued success on the messaging front remains to be seen. A lot of what the administration wants to accomplish is likely to be blocked in Congress, as several other speakers have mentioned. And there's only so much surrogates can do to spin that, of course. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oops.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
For that great presentation. So we have a few questions that have come in. It does seem, Chuck, that a few of your comments were provocative. I think that, you know, I do know who's writing this in, and I don't think it's a great inflation issue, but they, you know, Fs are not popular at Princeton, and they don't seem to be popular in this case either. So I'm gonna ask, you know, Martha also brought up that she wasn't gonna grade, but she wasn't sure she agreed completely on immigration. So I thought the question is directed at you, which is why is this an F? You know, is Trump also an F? Do you think that this administration has made things worse? So if you could explain a little more about your grading here, and then
Sure.
Martha and other panelists also could jump in, but I was
Sure.
pointing to Martha since she explicitly brought it up in her comments as well.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, I said at this moment in time, it's pretty good to have a president who's a little bit on the boring side, but it's rarely a good thing on a panel like this. So I was trying to be a little provocative, and maybe I'll have to walk some of that back. But here's what I had in mind. If you look at what the Biden administration has done, and I'm speaking pretty politically here as a political scientist, they have really put the Republicans on their back foot, as the Brits would say. So the packages they put together and the public messaging that they've done has been quite effective. As you know, if the best the Republicans can do is make up stories about hamburgers and then complain about a lack of bipartisanship, that's quite a success for a Democratic administration in the 100 days. The one place where they have left themselves really quite wide open, where they've handed the Republicans a gigantic baseball bat to beat the Democrats' brains in, is the situation on the border. So for how I would grade the Trump administration, I don't know what a grade is lower than an F, but I would give them lower than an F, right? And I don't know the right solution. I really don't know, right? But it is going to be a disaster for the Democrats if they don't do something there to stop a perceived, you know, situation that's out of control. I have a friend who is a serious Trump person. I occasionally see him every so often. And he usually, knowing that I'm an Ivy League professor, he has a strong suspicion that I'm not part of the Trump team. And usually he kids me about socialists. The last time I saw him, he said, "Are you practicing your Spanish?" Right. So the perception and the public opinion on this are not going to be favorable to a border that seems out of control. So I think they do have to do something about that. What? I have no idea. We could make some guesses, but you know, I don't want to go that way. Was there anything else, Brandice? More than immigration? Yeah. Is that it? Is that the only grade people didn't like? I should have given some other wacky grades.
Well, that was the one that received.
It got people going. Okay.
That received the most attention. We can
Yeah.
come back on some
Okay.
of the grades in a moment. Yeah. Martha, did you want to add anything about you since you brought it up?
I can add just briefly. I don't disagree that it is a political challenge for the president, for Democrats. as it would be for anyone in that situation. I just think that we're in a situation where they just got the keys to the car. It's a pandemic. It was a situation that was extremely poorly managed by the outgoing administration. It is not easy, as you said, these are not easy things to manage, particularly when you're dealing with children who are not with an adult. You have to take extreme care in making sure that those children are looked after properly, and that's hard to do in the environment that we're in. So I would just say, I guess on this one, I would say give them a bit more time. Give the vice president some time to figure out if there is something that can be done to help improve the conditions of the countries that people are fleeing. I just think this is one where, you know, again, the pandemic combined with the outgoing circumstances means that there has to be some allowance for them to figure out how best to manage a situation that is difficult to manage in a country without open borders. But I don't disagree that politically it's a challenge and is something they will have to keep their eye on.
Okay, so we have some questions that deal with sort of the prospects for kind of legislative compromise and legislative success. You know, and they're related, although, you know, at times with the, as you know, Chuck pointed out, with the 50 to 51 votes in the Senate, there are on some policies, right, reconciliation will enable the Democrats to do it in a way that doesn't need to be bipartisan, but as long as the filibuster's around, and so even if it's reformed, if it's here in any form, right, there's going to be a need potentially for some compromise. So there's some questions about the likelihood of bipartisanship on some of these issues. And I thought we could start with LaFleur, if you wanted to, if you had thoughts, either in the area of racial justice, but also, you know, you work on public opinion, you know, feel free to broaden as well if you'd like.
Sure, thanks, Brandice. I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess I would say, in terms of the likelihood of passage. I've neglected to mention in my comments earlier that President Biden last night gave a deadline, I believe, of May 25th. So on that end, I think he's maybe overly ambitious. I don't see that legislation passing, I guess, in less than a month. That being said, given where public opinion is on the matter, majorities of Americans are saying that police reform is important and that they do support police reform. Even among sort of lay Republicans, there is relatively more support than I think we would anticipate. And so at least at sort of the mass level, there does seem to be support. Now, whether that pushes you know, who we refer to as political leads or politicians in the Senate to support that legislation is a different story. But at least knowing that public opinion is generally supportive of this, it would at least suggest that there is some potential or maybe likely movement on this. With respect to immigration, I didn't speak as much about that. I think I'm less hopeful. And in both of these cases, I mean, my optimism is pretty tempered. You know, I'm not thinking of anything as a particular slam dunk, but when it comes to legislation around immigration and just given, I don't know, like the last 20 years in terms of what we've seen in terms of movement on immigration, I'm far less hopeful there. And if we even look to some of the legislation that passed recently with respect to, you know, calling out anti-Asian bias, you know, that passed overwhelmingly with the exception, I believe, of Senator Hawley from Missouri. So if that's any sort of litmus test, then I think, you know, we could be, again, cautiously optimistic around the George Floyd Policing Act.
Did anyone else want to weigh in either on the George Floyd Policing Act or other?
Well, I can try to be provocative again.
Okay.
So let's just think about what would be happening if the Democrats had 62 seats. Okay. And to see what that would be, it's very helpful to actually read the platform. Most people think that those platforms are just basically BS, empty guff. The scholarship on this by presidential scholars shows that's absolutely not true. They try very, very, very hard to deliver on what's in those platforms. And if they had 62 votes, here's what would be happening. There would be gun control, like a strong gun control. There'd be a Voting Rights Act. There'd be statehood for DC and Puerto Rico and maybe the Virgin Islands. There would be a lot of big stuff on the Green New Deal. There would be some sort of immigration reform. And many of the things that were featured in the speech last night, like community colleges and lots of child services, those would be real. There may be some of the child stuff that happens, but on the other, all the other stuff on that list is not going to happen. That's the difference between having 50 votes and having 62 votes, or even maybe 57. I agree with LaFleur that there is an open window on police reform. And there's some obvious compromises that can be made, and I would not be surprised. In fact, I would be surprised if there isn't a bill, a law. We could talk about how effective it would be, but I think that there actually is something there. Infrastructure is also a place where things can happen, but in a slightly tricky way. And it deals, and the issue is budget reconciliation, which Brandice mentioned, and which is getting some discussion in the media. But the discussion in the media is a little bit superficial. Frankly, this is not that hard to understand. Under budget reconciliation, you can take existing budget lines and bump them up or bump them down, but you cannot start new programs. Okay. Now, in infrastructure, which I've learned a lot about because in the undergraduate policymaking class, we did a really big simulation on this. And as usual, the Princeton undergraduates did a brilliant job. And I have a pretty good suspicion about what's going to happen, right? And I can talk more about this. I don't want to drone on and on. But the answer is there's tons of infrastructure programs that already exist. And by just bumping them up and being clever about it, you can actually do a lot of infrastructure stuff. But you cannot do a lot of the Green New Deal stuff. For example, the idea of putting electric charging stations all up and down the interstate highways, I think that's a new program. But if you have to go with reconciliation, right, so that you can use pure majority rule and get it through with 50 votes, then you're not going to be able to do a lot of the Green New Deal stuff. You'll get bridges, roads, highways, airports, sewage, no lead pipes. You can do that. So there's lots of stuff, but you're not going to get a lot of the Green New Deal. And it's going to have to be through reconciliation, because when push comes to shove, the Republicans are too split to agree on the pay-fors and on the requirements for unions that the Democrats would like. Okay, so I said too much on that. So I'm sort of emphasizing the glass 3/4 empty rather than 1/4 full. So there are things that can happen, that really can happen or are likely to happen, but not the stuff, not the incredibly ambitious legislative program that you find in the Democratic platform.
Brandice, I can just say one other thing about reconciliation, not to take this panel off into that, although I would love it. I teach federal budget. I would just say, I think the jury's a little bit more out, maybe, Chuck, than you characterized. I mean, for example, in 1996, reconciliation was used to build an entirely new welfare program called TANF in the wake of the destruction of an old one, AFDC, and the rulings of the parliamentarians sort of flex over time. And so I think it's a little bit less clear what can and can't happen, but fundamentally, reconciliation does constrain what can happen policy-wise. I don't disagree with that.
We're getting a lot of questions about the elections and the midterm elections in 2022. And some of them, I'm going to try to group some of them together. Okay, so some people are upset at Chuck's comment that the Democrats are definitely going to lose control of Congress. And Martha pointed that out in her comments, and others may want to pick up on that. We're also getting comments, though, about the census and how redistricting may influence, potential electoral outcomes. Lauren, you haven't, I don't know if you'd be interested in weighing in and on this one, otherwise I'll direct, the next one to
Sure, I can. So I have a few different thoughts on some of the different topics so far, but I do have a couple on the ones that you just said. So I'll start with broadly popular opinion on legislative measures the Biden administration has pursued versus some of those where there's less public support. And, there's some reason to believe that the Biden administration has sort of gone against, popular opinion vis-a-vis the honeymoon period. This is when your popularity is highest. You should put the toughest measures through that would typically have the least chance. But they've instead, because of the political division in Congress, gone with measures like infrastructure that has about 70% support, no matter how you slice it. Similar measures for the COVID relief bill. But I actually thought, I tend to agree more with what Chuck said about the Green New Deal's measure of infrastructure. When I listened to Tim Scott's speech last night, I thought he provided an opening there for Democrats by saying, Republicans will work with you on the roads and bridges. We just don't want these other things. Democrats could respond to that and say, okay, here, maybe we can approach this in more of a piecemeal manner. My bet would be that Republicans would still not be on board for that, but that type of challenge might be politically useful. I'll also say that, I think the Biden administration is probably thinking of the midterms pursuing these popular legislative items instead of some more controversial ones. And so I wonder if the news cycle will continue to change or if those will still have broad support enough to maybe allow the Democrats to hold on to one chamber. I'm not quite sure. And I'll just say something quickly about, measures of Biden's legislative success so far. There's a lot of comparisons with FDR. I think they're a little bit oversimplified. FDR pushed through about 15 major pieces of legislation in the first month. We have obviously fewer than that, but where they have been on par is executive actions. Biden had 28 executive orders in the first 2 weeks. FDR had 30 in the first month. And so I think the administration is open to pursuing that strategy, but obviously they would like to work with Congress for a few other things.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the elections? Yeah.
Well, I want to hear what LaFleur has to say, but I will just admit right off the bat that I have no magic crystal ball. And I don't know what's going to happen in 18 months. And you can come up with some scenarios where events are going to make a big difference. So if the economy is totally roaring hot and it's really looking good, that's going to be very good for the administration. But you can come up with all sorts of other scenarios. For example, the COVID is raging out of control in a bunch of places in the world, and that's a situation for breeding vaccine-resistant strains. And it's not impossible to imagine that all the vaccinations that have occurred in the United States could be completely, sent back to ground zero. And 18 months from now, we could all be in lockdown again. So those events are going to be big. But the fundamental point is that the Democrats' hold on power is extremely fragile, really fragile. The situation in the House doesn't look good for them. It's a little better. The map in the Senate is better. But depending upon how these breaks go, right, the Biden administration could be facing a unified Republican Congress, right? So again, we can talk about that. I'm hardly the best person to talk about it. And I'd actually like to hear LaFleur's thoughts on it.
I'm actually quite sympathetic to what you have to say, Chuck. So I might temper it a slight bit in the sense that I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, for example, that the Democrats will lose the House. But given what we know, I think part of the question that Brandice originally asked was about redistricting in the census. State legislatures across the country are Republican controlled. And so if they get to determine how the lines are drawn, what we know about parties and incentives and electoral incentives, then I think it's fair to say that these districts will be drawn sympathetically in a way that would likely lead to more sort of polarized, extremely gerrymandered districts. And so if we take that as a given, yeah, in that respect, I don't expect it to be especially hopeful, but I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a foregone conclusion.
Martha, there's a question for you. And then if you want to weigh in on the congressional elections as well, feel free. This is about what Biden needs to do to get ready for the administrative presidency. Maybe if I know there's a lot of confidential issues on being part of a transition team, but if you are able to say anything more about what you see as sort of the key next stages to kind of filling out, all these, massive numbers, of appointed positions that go below the main cabinet level ones.
Sure, and I should clarify, so my service on the transition team ended at noon on January 20th, so I am no longer a member of that team. Most of us, that's how it wrapped up. So I would say they're already doing it. I mean, for example, anything that requires, there's a statute called the Administrative Procedure Act that requires certain kinds of administrative actions, certain kinds of regulations to go through what's called a notice and comment process. And to withstand judicial scrutiny in some cases. And that was a lot of what happened to the Trump administration, is they weren't careful enough about that process. And I think the courts clamped down on them, and the courts could easily clamp down on a Biden administration too. So mindful of all of that, they did start early. They started in transition. They've continued that work. I mean, Chuck mentioned the obscure little office of OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is nested within OMB and the White House, kind of manages this regulatory process. And those folks are busy. So I think that they are working already on making sure that they have things that are teed up that can go through the process such that they can get them done and implemented during this term of this presidency. So I don't think they're going to sort of wait and see how next November goes. These folks, I think, are walking and chewing gum. And I say that not just because I admire them and came from working with them. That's just my observation of them.
Yeah, Chuck, did you want to follow up? Since you spoke?
No, that's good to hear. And I know Martha's not going to be too critical of the Obama administration, but I thought oftentimes they didn't think down the grain tree as well. And it's good that the Biden people are thinking a little bit about that. I would say a word about judicial appointments, and that is really going to be critical. The Senate's going to be super critical there. So they need to be really aggressive about this. And every time that needs to be queued up in advance. And the moment a vacancy opens, they need to have somebody up there and get them through the Senate as soon as possible. The sort of more leisurely pace is not really an option here. And if the Senate does go Republican in the next election, I think you can pretty confidently, we're a little bit off the edge of the map here, but I would expect that most of the judicial vacancies that open up, the Republicans would not allow them to be filled. And that would include seats on the Supreme Court. They would keep them open for as long as 2 years in an effort to try to fill them under a Republican president. So that's really use it or lose it. They really have to be very aggressive and very fast and skillful on that.
There's a question that's directed to Lauren about, although others I think would have great insight in this as well, LaFleur in particular, but Martha and Chuck too, of course, which is, what do the panelists think the lasting contributions of Biden's increased gender and racial diversity of appointments will be? So in terms of, policy formation, candidate recruitment, is it going to put pressure on future presidents? So Lauren, you talked about the gender balance of appointments in particular. So maybe you could lead off, and then I'd be interested in what LaFleur thinks on race and others think, more broadly with this, cabinet diversity.
Yeah, sure. So I do think the most important thing is to set a standard and a norm. And the Biden cabinet is about 45% women. And so we're almost to that 50% mark. And I do think it puts pressure on future presidents, Republican and Democrat, to try to reach that. And I also think, just beyond the representation, which is extremely important, both substantively and descriptively from a policy standpoint, there is a ton of professionalism, and these are very experienced appointments being made. And so experience is being weighed much more than loyalty, much more than, we often think of the Trump administration that way, but this is really a very experienced and it's a cabinet of specialists, really. And I think that adds to the smoothness and the organization that we've seen in the administration so far. And just before turning it over to LaFleur, because I'd like to hear what she has to say too, I'll put the appointments in context. So of roughly 1,200 Senate confirmed positions, presidents have to fill. Biden's at about 40. Obama was at 67 at this point, so it's a little slower than that, but Trump had 25. He had barely filled a cabinet at this point. And Bush, I believe, was at 33. And so he's sort of, between the Obama administration and the Bush administration there. But there have been no failed cabinet nominations except for one withdrawal, which is quite notable. And I think it just speaks to the professionalism of the people being selected, the experience, and the respect that they have in Washington for working in a bipartisan manner.
Great. I think before I get to the cabinet, I'd like to speak just even first about the presidential ticket and the idea that, a lot has been made about last night and the optics of having behind him as he delivered his address to Congress, Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris, sort of flanking him. And I think one thing that I'd like to highlight is with his choice of Kamala Harris as his vice president, I feel fairly confident in saying that I don't think we're going to return, at least on the Democratic Party side, to seeing, an all-male, all-white ticket. I think those days are likely behind us. And given, maybe maybe that's a little too sanguine, but I think within sort of the base of the party, there's not an appetite for that sort of lack of racial and gender diversity. And I think we saw that play out in the Democratic primaries, even though we ended up, or I shouldn't say we, but they ended up electing, a 76-year-old white guy. When it comes to the cabinet appointments, I think one area that's really interesting to look at is at the Justice Department, right? So he picks Merrick Garland as Attorney General, and some of the sort of critique was that he didn't necessarily have the civil rights chops as maybe other potential appointees, but he's also appointed, Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, people, to Lauren's point, who have that long history and legacy of professionalism and expertise. And I think we're going to see that play out in real substantive ways, and that we've already seen that play out in substantive ways. So contrast this with, the Trump administration and former Attorney General Barr's decision not to lead an inquiry into the Minneapolis Police Department. In the aftermath of the conviction of Chauvin, not to keep on belaboring this, but this is quite central to, I think, thoughts about race and politics in the United States right now. The Justice Department has actually opened inquiries into police departments in Louisville and Minneapolis, and more are likely to come. And I think this does speak to both expertise, but also diverse perspectives in terms of who's at the table and the decisions that get made. And so, at least on that dimension, it looks, I think, quite promising, and looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
Thanks for those perspectives. Okay, we have a question that I'm going to direct to Martha, but it could go to anyone, but it does play off of some of Martha's comments that she made in her opening remarks. So often there's a flurry of activity at the beginning of a president's term, right? Partly because there's sort of a shift in who's in office, so that there are kind of opportunities for policy advancement that were gridlocked arguably in the previous term. There's also, not with all presidents, but with most presidents, there's a honeymoon period, right? So Trump did not have a honeymoon, and actually Bill Clinton didn't have a big honeymoon, right? He had the three-way race. Anyway, we won't get into who didn't have a honeymoon in 1830 or something, but we'll, but most presidents have a honeymoon. So there's a variety of factors that sort of contribute to a lot of success early on. So, but you know, the Biden administration's taken a little bit of this tone of we're just getting started. So, you know, Martha, you commented a little bit about this, but I wonder, do you know, and the kind of just getting started isn't, and the honeymoon isn't only 100 days. There's not a clear marcation, but do you see bigger challenges ahead as the administration moves out of this sort of honeymoon period and sort of the ability to take the low-hanging fruit that's got lots of popular support and the previous administration didn't take? Or do you think we're more in this just getting started phase?
Yeah, it's a great question and a hard one to answer. I was thinking as you were posing the question that I would love to have been part of a Democratic transition and early Democratic presidency that was not in the midst of a national crisis. So the Obama transition, Great Recession, this one, pandemic plus recession. And so I think of honeymoons as kind of that window of time where you can get legislation done because the public's with you. Congress sort of feels like they need to follow along with you. And both in the case of President Obama and in the case of President Biden, they had to use that to address the near-term challenges. President Obama then followed it up with getting healthcare reform done. I think we don't know yet which of the many things President Biden has put out there he will be able to accomplish as a follow-up. But I think of the honeymoon largely in the legislative realm. And in both cases, they did have, I mean, President Obama had 60 votes for a period of time, but in both cases, they do have control of Congress. And I think that is how you have to use your honeymoon if you're in one. Beyond that, I think it just gets to this broader judgment that they've made that they can, some other panelists have spoken about this, where there are issues where the public's solidly with them, even if the other party is resisting, I think they can get a lot further in pushing on executive action as well as legislative action. But I think mostly we're in the crisis we're in, and that's how they have to use their honeymoon. And I don't know what comes beyond that part because I don't know when the crisis is over.
Well, it is true you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And partly the recovery package is a great illustration of that. But I do think, I guess I'm taking a slightly more structural view of it. And again, I don't want to get too wonky about it. And I put less emphasis on public opinion. That once you have this changeover in personnel and control, and in this sense, control of the Senate and having a unified government was huge. There were things that were simply not possible before, which become possible, right? They move out of the gridlock region and you can deal with them. And you begin to work your way through those. And after a while, you've exhausted them all and there aren't any more. And that's pretty much it. So for sure, because of the crisis and because there are areas where they have public support, they should rock and roll. But after a while, there's just not going to be that much they can do, especially with the control that they've got. And then at which point, absolutely, it shifts to the administrative state and doing things with executive orders and just by managing the agencies and pushing the programs aggressively and creatively. So, yeah, I guess, again, I'm a little more pessimistic.
So Chuck, this is a follow-up that's from one of our remaining audience questions. Which is someone is asking whether you see parallels to today's intra-democratic party politics to the late 1970s and 80s. So I think this is building off of your comments. This question actually came in while you were speaking, and about whether Biden can be successful in integrating social movements in a way that sort of the Democrats in the 70s and 80s were less successful.
Whoa, that's a really big question. and a really critical question. And I'm sure everybody's going to want to weigh in on this if we have time. So it's partly related to this. What's the grand strategy behind all this? And if you look at it, I'm inclined to take Biden's word fairly seriously on this, and that some of what they're doing is aimed at trying to glue together the Roosevelt coalition that has basically fractured, eroded, and more or less defunct. So a lot of it really is aimed at blue collar people and trying to form a coalition with the highly educated people and the Democrats and the racial minorities, which are the sort of backbone of the party. That does not have to, I guess I again have to be a little skeptical about really putting the FDR coalition back together again, but that's not necessary. To win electorally, they just have to improve on what they've got a little bit, right? I can keep going on this. The Republicans slot into the distribution of Republicans slots into American electoral institutions perfectly, whereas the distribution of Democrats across the country is basically a square peg in a round hole, and they have to get, in order to win elections, they have to push the coalition building in clever ways. Again, it doesn't have to go all the way back to Roosevelt, but you can see them trying, right? If they can strengthen the unions, if they can do the infrastructure package. He was explicit in the comments last night that a lot of this is going to help people without college degrees, right? He doesn't have to put all the pieces back together again. He just has to patch it up a bit. And that could really be a big turnaround for the Democrats. I'm sure probably everybody wants to talk about this. Let's see what they say.
Would anyone else like to weigh in?
I guess I'll weigh in. Yeah, I largely agree with what Chuck had to say, actually. And I alluded to some of this in some of my earlier comments, which is that for the Democratic Party, this is in some ways a fragile coalition between, highly educated whites, or at least college educated whites, racial and ethnic minorities, and to some degree, working class whites, many of whom left the party after Obama's election. And so there remains this tension, I think, in terms of how much does the party want to focus on winning back some of those more sort of racially moderate whites? And does that come at the expense of who Chuck referred to as the backbone of the Democratic Party? And I think this is kind of like one of the big questions that we see facing the Democratic Party, and that will, in some ways, they'll continue to be plagued by. Biden, however, to his credit, I think has been able to make inroads. And like Chuck said, he doesn't have to win them all, but he was able to make inroads in a way that can sort of, stave off any real major losses or problems. And so there's going to be this, I think, ongoing tension as to how he puts forth policies. Is he pushing them as universal? Is he pushing them as being able to advance racial equity? And will a message of racial equity isolate some of those same moderate voters or moderate whites that he's also trying to keep in the coalition? And I guess I would say it's not a job that I envy, but it's one that is that he's tasked with.
I'll jump in really quickly, Brandice, if there's time.
Yes, there's time. Briefly,
Just
and we want to leave time.
A really quick one.
All around.
Well,
yeah.
I just totally agree with what LaFleur is saying. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately is just that the divisions within the Democratic Party between the more conservative and progressive wing, which is very real. And we're seeing it play out with progressives who want a Medicare expansion as part of the economic legislation Biden just introduced, and he's already said no. those tensions are very real. And in typical times, if there was not a dysfunctional Republican Party, they would absolutely, that would be a boon to the Republicans. But I think the remnants of Trumpism and conspiracy theories within the party have made it impossible for Republicans to have any policy-based conversations because they're constantly defending the outrageous remarks of some of their members. And so I think that would typically be a benefit to them. I think that they are having so many issues within their own caucus that they're not able to take advantage of the Democratic cleavages right now.
Well, we do have some remaining questions, but unfortunately we're at 6 p.m. So we're gonna have to try to have another panel soon where we can get all of your wisdom again. But I want to very much thank each of you. Now this is just in the order on my screen. So LaFleur, Martha, Lauren, and Chuck, all of you for just these fabulous remarks and commentary on a very exciting 100 days and looking forward, as all of you have mentioned, into the next several hundred days of our new administration. So thanks again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our
Brandice.
audience for coming, for listening and for asking such great questions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you just asked too many. So we can't get to all of them, but to a fantastic group of audience members as well.